Good morning, or afternoon. You are listening to the Penguin Review. I'm Rebecca. Here in studio, we have Alex.
Hello.
Tom.
Hello.
And a special guest. Hi.
Hi.
Okay, sorry.
We have sitting in with us Chris Barzak, who is a pretty big deal around here.
Yeah, pretty much.
I don't know about that.
Oh, you're being modest.
Kind of a big deal.
You're being modest. He is a local author and teacher here at YSU. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, yeah. I'm an associate professor in the English department at YSU, and my subject matter is teaching creative writing, fiction writing specifically. I'm a novelist and a short story writer. My first novel, One for Sorrow, was just recently made into the movie called Jamie Marks is Dead, which premiered this past January at the Sundance Film Festival in the dramatic competition. One of 16 films that were selected for that. And it was then released at the end of August into limited major cities in the U.S. and is now on video on demand platforms, and the DVD is about to come out at the end of this month on October 28th. And it's just making the rounds now in the film festival circuit in Europe. In Spain, it just won Best Cinematography. But,
That's so awesome.
Cool.
Yeah.
Congratulations. Yes,
Thanks.
yes.
That's the perfect DVD release date, too.
Oh, right.
There you go.
Yeah,
There you
right
go.
before Halloween.
Yeah.
It's a ghost story.
Yeah, it's a good one
Yeah,
for
yeah.
Halloween. Yeah.
We'll probably talk about that in a little bit, but for now, I think, if it's okay with you guys, I kind of want to talk about where you sort of started from writing.
Sure.
Like what
Like,
inspired
how
you?
far
Like,
back do you want to go?
I
don't know.
maybe what you were like, what sort of got you into it? Maybe what you were reading at the time, or something like that.
Well, I literally did start writing when I was a little kid. I really can't remember the time when I didn't write. It was as soon as I was able to read and write that I started to write stories. Prior to that, pre literacy, I used to draw sequential pictures and tell stories that way, and then I'd like staple them together and give them to my mom, tell her it was a book that I made for her. But as soon as I was able to put words together, I dropped that and started to write stories instead of draw them, which actually I think was kind of a loss in some ways because I can't draw at all now.
Oh.
So no skill sets there.
Unfortunate.
And I can remember winning short story competitions in elementary and junior high and high school and things like that. And I always read, but I fell in love with reading probably in the 4th grade. I read a book by Jean Craighead George called My Side of the Mountain.
Oh, I love that book.
Yeah.
It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, I just tore through that in one night. I had never sort of fallen into a book so immersively before that one. And it's a great kind of it's like a chapter book for kids,
right.
but it's like the first kind of novel trying on reading a long narrative for a little kid. I guess probably by the time I was a teenager, I was pretty serious about it, even though, people in my family thought it was cute, but the older I got, the less cute they thought it was. Because when I was getting ready to graduate high school and people were, what are you going to do? And, I said that I wanted to go to college and I wanted to be a writer. And then it became a worry more, because they thought that writing was something that people who lived in New York City did, and that somebody from my modest background, should just go get a practical degree that has a job at the end of it.
Right.
And unfortunately, I really wasn't interested in practical things. Or maybe it was fortunate.
I don't blame you at all.
Yeah, I think it's very fortunate.
Because it has worked out for me. So I went into college and I studied English and just tried to read as voraciously as possible because I wanted to learn as many tricks about writing as I could, and I know that you can't just read what you like in order to do that. You have to see what other kinds of writers are doing. There are all kinds of things that they do that you can use in your own to good effect too. And after I graduated with my undergraduate degree, I moved around the U.S. a little bit, lived in different places, worked some odd jobs, continued reading and studying writing on my own. Ended up coming back to YSU to do a master's degree in English. By then I was publishing short stories in magazines. I was 24. And after I graduated with my MA, I stuck around and taught part-time for a year and gave myself that year to write the first draft of my first novel, which I did. And I got my first literary agent with that manuscript. And then I moved to Japan for a couple of years. And the manuscript didn't sell immediately. It was rejected by like 20 different publishers.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
I wrote my second book while I was in Japan, and by the time I was done with 2 years of living there, the first one did finally sell, and luckily I had a second one ready to go too. And that's just sort of how it's been since then. I mean, I have a hard time answering your original question, which is, what got me into it, because I don't know. I just did it. I just
think
loved
that's
it.
a good question, because
but-
I don't think a lot of writers tend to know. It's just sort of
Yeah.
what happens.
Yeah, like I can remember particular instances of books that affected me, but it wasn't that I hadn't liked reading or before that. It was just that this book, this particular book or story completely wowed me, and floored me. But yeah, I can't really figure out origin point for why I do it.
It's a hard question, I think, to answer. For your first novel, what was sort of the inspiration behind that, One for Sorrow?
Well, there are several, different things that went into why I wanted to write that book. When I started it, it had actually started as a short story that I had written, and I had already published it, and I liked the story a lot, but for a year or two after I had written it and it had already been published, I just kept thinking about it, and mainly the narrator of the story, who's also the narrator of the novel, is a 15-year-old kid who grew up in this area. At the end of the short story, he's in a very dark place, and while it makes sense as a short story, I think I was bothered by the kind of place that I'd left him in the short story. I don't know why exactly. Usually after I've written something and I'm done with it, but I kept hearing his voice, and I had been publishing short stories probably for about 4 or 5 years at that point, and I knew that at some point I wanted to try writing a novel, even though it seemed like a really overwhelming task. And I knew that I would have a hard time writing one if I didn't have a certain amount of things driving me to do it. And the story kept, popping up in my head with his voice, and I thought, he seems like a very chatty narrator, so that would probably be useful, at least in terms of getting page count.
Right.
And there were a lot of characters in the short story, which usually there aren't in short stories. There are usually just several, and when you start getting past 3 or 4 characters in a short story, you're getting a big cast, which seems that's more like a big stage instead of a small stage. And so I thought, okay, I have a lot of people in this story, which means a lot of different people that I could use to interact with in a more book length format. And and then of course there was the motivation to try to give that narrator, Adam McCormick, a chance to figure out how to make his life better rather than sort of shutting down like he does at the end of the short story. And so those are the 3 sort of technically driving things. And then inspirationally, in a sense that, I wanted to write a novel that took place in the Mahoning Valley, here where I grew up. because I was such a reader growing up, it was like a great way for me to see other places. My family didn't really travel a whole lot, and I was always interested in other places. And of course, as Generation X, and we didn't get the internet until I was like 18 or 19. So I couldn't just Google images from other countries or other places in the U.S. So I read, and I went to those places in books. And what I noticed, though, at a certain point after I'd read a lot of books, was that there were none that were set here that I could find, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to make one that was set here. And if it was the only book that I wrote, then that was going to be the one. And so there was that, too.
Yeah, I remember when I read it about a year and a half ago, like you mentioned the university, you mentioned Dorian's. I think now, correct me if I'm wrong, because this was a year and a half ago when I read it. But he lives in Kinsman, correct? Or around Kinsman?
Yeah, like the town in the book isn't named, mainly because I wanted to use a lot of different specific locations that are in about 4 or 5 different townships out in northern Trumbull County, where I grew up, which is like, some of them are in Kinsman, some of them are in Gustavus or Johnston or Mecca or Greene, kind of thing. So I'm like, well, I won't name it. That way nobody can sort of lock me down into literal geography.
Yeah.
But yeah, out there, northern Trumbull County. Yeah.
It's kind of fun, too, because, like, you could look at all these landmarks and then, like, kind of drive by them, and it's like, oh, hey,
yeah,
this character was here.
It's
It's weird.
That's great.
Another thing I noticed when I read the book was the book had a real sense of, like, atmosphere to it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it was creepy. Like some of the parts were just, like, when he's out in the woods, and I don't know if I'm spoiling anything for the book, but...
Spoiler alert.
It's not, I don't know.
It's
I
okay,
wouldn't
you're
call it
fine.
spoiler,
At
but
some
like,
point.
just like, yeah. Big twist. But, like, the way you write it feels almost like magical realism to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Was that, like, an intention, or?
Yeah, it was, definitely. I love magical realist writing. I like writing that's sort of set in the here and now, but that has some kind of strange or weird or magical kinds of things going on in it at the same time as the realist stuff. And so, yeah, it was purposeful. When I was a teenager, I read a lot of fantasy fiction, but it was of the sort that was more like Dungeons and Dragons fantasy, like elves and wizards and
Right.
that sort of thing. And but in my 20s, I encountered magical realist writing, and that really spoke to me in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And it made sense to me in some way. I liked the metaphors that you could create and literalize in that kind of writing. And it was kind of what I was doing at that point in my short stories anyway. I just didn't realize it was a thing.
Yeah.
So I started to research and read as many magical realist authors as I could at that point. And when I wrote One for Sorrow, I wanted to write a ghost story where the ghosts felt very real and not necessarily the way they would in traditional ghost stories, where they're sort of either there for cheap scares or they're there to deliver a kind of piece of information to somebody else in the story, that in order to go back and solve the crime that actually led to their murder, or put them at rest at some way, or bring someone to justice, that kind of a thing. So they're generally treated, supernaturally, but I wanted to treat the supernatural naturally.
Right.
And so most of the ghosts in the book just interact like they would if they were alive.
Right.
They're just dead.
Right.
Right. That's the sense that I got when I read it, because, like, at no point, like, unless the character had reminded me, did I feel like they were ghosts and dead, or, like, whenever they would do something, I don't want to
strange
say
or magical,
ghost-like,
yeah.
but stranger,
Mhm.
yeah, like
Mhm.
that. Like that's when I was like, oh yeah, I
Oh,
forgot.
yeah,
That's
right.
right.
Uh-huh.
They're
This is
dead.
a dead person.
Whoops.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. I'm glad that you could forget that they were for a bit.
Yeah. Let's talk about maybe the film a little bit.
Mhm.
How did that come about? Like, I know the director approached you about it.
Yeah, he approached my literary agent about it. It was probably about 8 months after the book was first published that my agent called me and said that there was a director who was interested in my book and making it into a film, and I got really excited. And my agent said, "Don't get too excited because
Aw, yeah.
this happens a lot, and it generally doesn't actually lead anywhere."
Okay.
And someone in the film industry, whether it's a screenwriter or a director or a producer, reads a book and falls in love with it and wants to make it into a film. But the problem after that is taking the idea to other people and getting them to fall in love with it too. And if they can't convince other people of it, then the film probably won't happen. And, they say something like probably like 95% of books that are optioned to be made into films don't actually get made into them.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
So, at some point, after trying for a few years to pull together interest from other corners of the film industry and not getting anywhere, people, they move on to their next idea because in the end they have to make money.
Right.
Put
Right.
food on their tables too. So I was, I took that advice and I said, okay, I won't get too excited, but it's cool just that somebody read it and was interested in it in that way.
Yeah.
So they optioned it. The director optioned it. So, and an option is different. Buying an option on a book is different from buying film rights. It's the first step that people take. They put a certain amount of money down, sort of like layaway.
Right, okay. Right.
This is mine and nobody else can make this into a film. I put my money down on it even though I haven't bought the rights outright. And, those options are good for a period of time, like a year and a half or 2 years, and then they can renew it kind of a thing if they want. And that's what happened with this director, Carter Smith. Yeah. And, he renewed his option a couple of times, several years had passed, where the book was just continually optioned. And, I still didn't think too much about it. I tried not to hope for something that wouldn't happen. And, at a certain point, probably, about 3 or 4 years in to the book being optioned, he contacted me. And when he contacted me, wanting to talk, I figured, oh, wow, this must be actually getting closer to reality for him if he actually wants to talk to me.
Did you suddenly lose that advice that your agent gave you and suddenly got excited?
I didn't know, because I was still like, I don't know.
See,
like,
if someone asked me that, I would not be able to contain
I'm
it.
very...
I would be nervous.
Yeah.
I'd be scared.
I was just like, I'll wait to get excited until I know exactly what.
Right.
I mean, maybe he wants to talk because he's going to tell me that this isn't going to happen.
That would
Even though
be
he really
yeah.
didn't have to contact me to do that. He would probably have just
Yeah.
contacted my agent. But so yeah, we started talking on the phone. He was developing a script and he had one already, but taking it through several different drafts, and he wanted to talk to me about different things that he was considering doing with the book as he adapted it to the screen. There are different things that necessarily happen when a book is adapted to a film. There are things that don't come with it, in translation, and sometimes they have to change something in order to make sense of something, the way stories progress on the screen instead of it on the page.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways that I realized as we were talking and stuff like that he wanted to know, if I was okay with these things, or if I, in some cases, had better ideas for how to solve some problems or something like that, or, insight into certain characters' motivations and things like that. And I saw a couple of different scripts over the years that he did, and it was radically different between the first one that I saw and the one that actually became the the final script.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even the script that he had going into shooting the film, there's probably, 30 or 40 minutes or 30 or 40 pages of it, that were filmed but that got cut even from the final product,
Right.
that they put together. And, so it was interesting to see all of that. So yeah, we talked on the phone, we emailed, at a certain point, probably about, 5 or 6 years after the book came out, he called and he had everything ready to go. The producers, the investors, the actors, the locations had been scouted, all of that stuff that they need to have in place, and they were ready to buy the rights, and that was like November, December 2012, and then like 4 or 5 months later they were on location in February and March of 2013, and they were filming it.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, at what point did you raise up your hands and go, yes?
Probably when I looked in my bank account in the morning after the movie rights money was deposited.
I don't blame
and I
you
was
at all.
like, oh my god, I'll never see that again.
Is that something that usually happens to an author? I mean, a lot of times you hear authors being very upset because they had no part of the process. This sounds like you had a large part of the process.
I was. I mean, I wasn't at the center of it, but I certainly was, consulted and not kept out of things. I don't think it happens to a lot of authors, to be honest. I know a few authors. I have friends who have had books also turned into movies. And probably of the 3 that I know, 2 of the 3 were sort of kept at arm's length and out of the process. And one was very much a part of it too, but probably more so than me. And I think the general rule of thumb, the wisdom that I got from other authors who had been through this or who knew people who had, is that most likely they'll pay you for your rights and then they'll just say goodbye, and they don't really want most authors involved, especially if they have an idea of what they want to do with it already, and if it's not something that the author will be happy with, then they just sort of go radio silent on them, and they've paid and they're going to do what they're going to do. But no, I very much felt like all the way through that the director was wanting me to be happy with what came out too.
Cool.
That's great.
Mhm.
That's really
That's
great.
really cool.
I think from a reader's perspective, and honestly, people listening to this should go see the movie and read the book
Yes,
and all that sort of stuff.
absolutely.
But for me, having read the book before seeing the movie, I was pretty happy with how they kept close to the source material. Like,
Mhm.
it seemed pretty much like I remember a couple things that they had taken out, but
Yeah.
I think I understand why they might have.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of characters who were cut.
Mhm.
In the book, there's a grandmother, but she was already dead before the book really started. She was really a character that only appeared in the book in Adam's memory,
Mhm.
when he would think about her, so there were scenes in the book with her, but they were all like flashback
Right.
and so that character didn't come along. In the book, Adam had a father. In the movie, it's a single mother that he's growing up in a household with a single mom. I think that was kind of an interesting choice because the book was about a family that was sort of teetering close to the edge of falling apart, and the dad was sort of constantly in and out of work, alcoholic, and I think one of the interesting choices in adaptation was to lose the dad, and in some ways to make it even more distressing, that there's only one parent in this household, and then when the mother is in the car accident and paralyzed, there's no one now there who can, work and take care of the household.
Right.
Right.
That sort of ups the ante even more in terms of what they're facing in that conflict. There were some scenes that were changed. Some locations that were changed in the book. At one point, Adam and Jamie, the ghost, they hole up after they've run away in the old Welsh church across from the Catholic diocese here in downtown Youngstown.
Mm-hmm.
It's an abandoned church, and in the movie they do that, but they do it not in a church, but in an abandoned warehouse kind of.
That's probably the biggest one that I remembered from that was like, oh hey, I think I remember this scene, but it should be at this church. But I mean, it didn't bother me. It didn't ruin the experience for me.
It didn't seem like, well, now suddenly this just doesn't work.
Yeah, I'm like, oh, shut the movie off now. Don't care for it.
I think there was like an additional scene or two in the movie that I hadn't written in the book, but I really liked them. And they felt organic to the material, not like they were forced in at all. And so it's like things like that. Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Great. We're gonna take a little break right now. So if you have any questions, hit us up on Facebook or at Penguin Review, or Twitter, also at Penguin Review. We'll be back in a couple minutes. Gonna leave you with a little bit of Vance Joy. And we're back, and you are listening to the Penguin Review on Rookery Radio. Tonight at 7 o'clock, there is the second annual Comedy Classic fundraiser here at YSU at the Hub in Kilcawley. There's a $5 cover. It's going to be real great. There's a great lineup. Joe McCormick, Johnny Dam, Jay Mills. So yeah, check that out. It's going to be awesome.
Cool.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah. So if you have any questions, feel free to let us know. We're on Facebook and Twitter at Penguin Review. You can also call us. The phone number here is 330-941-4010. Join our conversation. So where are we going to start now?
Again, we're still here with author Chris Barzak.
Still here,
yeah.
Oh.
Gotta kick this guy out.
Oh, boy.
For the break, we were talking about his film, or the adaptation of his novel to film. Now I think we're going to talk about just writing in general, mostly because, like, as people who do creative work, we're interested in that sort of thing.
Sure.
Processes. What do you do?
What do I do? I think my processes are different depending on what kind of thing I'm doing. They're different between short stories and novels, and they're different even when I'm writing a particular type of story. So, I mean, I guess I'll start with, no matter what, I think I always start, I get an idea, or an image, or a voice, a character who I hear speaking in dialogue to another character, or even just to me as a kind of test reader or audience. If the idea comes to me through a voice and I just like the character's voice, then I need to do a lot of exploratory writing in order to find out what else is there beyond the voice. Who's the character? What's their conflict? Where am I going to go with this story? If it's an image, it's also a lot of exploration. Why is this image that I've imagined seems so poignant to me, and sort of digging around, trying to figure out the central idea behind that image, and how do I make a story out of that. most recently I've been writing short stories that are retellings of classic genre fiction, and like The Invisible Man and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and The Wizard of Oz and Peter Pan, things like that. And that's been incredibly different from writing stories that are generated solely from my own imagination, since these ones are, you know, kind of like working with someone else's material, but trying to work my own angle on them. Those ones are very idea driven, where I get to explore issues, I think, that are kind of buried in a lot of those original texts, largely because they were written in the early 1900s or in the Victorian period, when certain things couldn't be talked about very easily or written about. So I've been exploring issues of class and race and sexuality and gender in a lot of those Victorian Gothic stories and early sci-fi and fantasy kinds of stories. And that's been, like I said, more idea driven, and those are actually easier for me to write when it's a very specific idea, that then I get to sort of tease out different scenes that I'm interested in the original work, and find ways to talk about the stuff that the Victorian author, for instance, would not have ever mentioned. You know, once I get the idea, a lot of it is developing the idea and the perspective until I feel like I have everything in place: plot, character, conflict, the sound of the piece, whether that's a character voice or my own authorial voice that I'm going to use in it. Like I said, I think a lot of that comes through exploratory writing until I hit upon what feels right to me. In some ways, kind of intuitive. The stuff that I do that is non-intuitive, that is more consciously done, is the things I make myself write in order to hit on the intuitive stuff where I go, okay, yeah, that sounds right. I can do that in that way with short stories fairly easily. With a novel, I have to have a little bit more. I have to know a little bit more in order to go forward with a novel, just because it's so big. I have to have a general sense of where the novel's going and where it's going to end, even if I don't know exactly what that ending will look like written out. Just a general idea, so that I have a direction to go in instead of floundering for, for that many pages. So I like to have a general idea of the end of a novel, even if I don't know how I'm going to get there, so that I can always have it in mind as I'm generating scenes, that there has to be like at least one litmus test for any scene that I generate, that it has to feel like it can lead to towards that end, so that the characters are all behaving and making decisions that make sense with that end in mind. And there's a lot of flexibility in that process, since that's the only one main guideline that I have for myself in novel writing. And then, sometimes if I get to a point where I don't know how to go forward, I'll end up sort of going, like, backtracking, and I'll look at everything that I've written. If I've written 100 pages and there are, 20 scenes in those 100 pages, then I'll literally sort of, like, outline what I've already done. It's called reverse outlining. And like, look at it just in terms of, like, a sentence describing what each scene does and accomplishes, so that I have 20 sentences instead of 100 pages to look at. And a lot of times when I do that and I boil it down, then I can sort of, like, recalibrate and see, okay, this is what I've done so far. And then I'll move from there into a process of trying to speculative outlining, where I'll let myself generate possibilities of where I can go forward, and I still just operate in that just, one sentence per potential scene kind of mode. And I do speculative outlining instead of rigid outlining, because I don't like being
I
held down.
agree with you completely.
Yeah, I don't like being held to anything, even if I've generated the idea. I've never liked people telling me what to do, even myself. So I always have to sort of like play little psychological games with myself. Like, it's speculative outlining. It's not true outlining. So if I change my mind, it's okay.
Yeah.
And once I do that, I mean, I think that's just a kind of exercise of getting your brain to free up. You know, I think like when you've stopped, all it is that you kind of got locked up for any variety of reasons, and you got to step away from the actual writing of the prose of the narrative on the page, and allow yourself to play games and to think about it more freely, instead of trying to generate actual scenes at that point. And when I do that, literally, with doing that just for a day or two, and just allowing myself to just sort of like dream about the story again instead of being locked into writing it, you know, page to page, it frees me up, and I go forward and usually hit upon something that I hadn't had in mind before that is a cool idea, and it gets me excited to start writing again.
Mm-hmm. Which do you prefer? Are you like a big time short story writer, or are you a novel guy, or?
At this point, I feel like it's equal love for both, but it didn't start off that way. I started writing short stories. I loved short stories. I loved the brevity and the conciseness, and how a really good one could make you feel like you read a novel. And at the same time, you read it in one sitting.
Right.
I loved that, you know. So, yeah, I started out loving the short story more than the novel, even though I did love novels too. And then, you know, it was really after I had written a couple of novels that I felt like I had had enough experience writing them at that point that my love for them started to grow, because initially it just felt like a kind of masochistic exercise. You know? It was really hard because I had not, you know, it's like the novel, like anything, it's a form, you know, so you really learn it by doing it. And, the more you do something, anything, hopefully the better you get at it. You know, it's practice. And the more you practice and the more you get better at things, the more adept you become, the more you're able to like what you're doing instead of, you know, it's like a little kid when they're just learning to walk as a toddler and they fall down and they cry, you know, because they didn't succeed at doing this thing that they wanted to do. But once they get it, yeah, they're pretty happy and they run around giggling and laughing. And I think it was kind of like that, you know, like once I found my feet with writing novels, that I was like, okay, this is a lot of fun.
Did you cry?
At various points. At some point, pretty much almost any of the novels I've written, I've cried. But but less so the more I've written them. But the first one, yeah, a lot.
How do you come up with names?
Character names?
Yeah, character names.
Oh, gosh. I think that's largely intuitive for me. Sometimes it's, I honestly haven't put a ton of thought into it. Other times I put a lot. I think it depends on the story. So I've written stories where, you know, there was a girl who's grown up with a lot of older people who've kind of raised her, and her mother is dead, and she has an older person's name too. And I can remember trying to think of a good older woman's name for a young girl, and I ended up naming her Sylvie, and because I wanted her to seem like an older person, even though she's young, and have that kind of juxtaposition of, you know, even though she's very young, having an older personality, more mature and whatnot, and trying to find a name that kind of matched that too. So that was more conscious, you know, thinking like that. Other times, I don't know. It's that weird kind of mystical thing. Like the character just comes and I know their name.
That's great. We have a question for you
Okay.
for one of our listeners. This is from Kenny. He says, "I just tuned in, but where do you find your inspiration to write? I know you wrote a book that is now a movie, but outside of this, where do you find your inspiration for writing? Is it all personal or environmental?"
Thanks for the question. I generally think it's mainly personal for me. I think so. I was talking earlier about, like, why did I start writing, which is, kind of the question, what inspires you? For me, it was just, a need to be heard, I think, partially. There was a critic who read almost all of my books and stories and wrote this long article about them a couple of years ago, and I read that article with fascination.
Yeah, that'd be
Somebody's
fantastic.
studying me,
Right? Oh, man.
That's interesting.
And and he has this big theory that almost all of my characters have trouble, and he used this term, which I had to look up, instantiating themselves. And I looked up instantiating, and it was like realizing themselves and making other people see them. And, either to be heard or seen.
Right.
And feeling invisible. And, and I thought about that. I was like, yeah, that's true on a variety of levels. When I started Delaney, he's got all these examples, and I'm like, wow. And I think that probably that even as a little kid, probably when, even though I was starting, writing at that age, that might have been it too. I was the youngest of three brothers, and, my parents had me, when they were 30 and they were both working. And I think that I had that kind of, last child, kind of baby of the family kind of thing. Like, pay attention to me, but everybody else has their lives already going.
Right.
And I got attention from my family for making up stories, especially funny ones, but they also, liked my spooky ones too. So I think it's partially that this is something I do that I'm, I feel like I have some level of talent and ability at that other people enjoy too. And then I do think that, because I love reading and I love books, that I just wanted to do it too. That at a certain point I was like, I want to make a story that somebody loves as much as I've loved some of these other authors' stories.
Right. I definitely feel the same way with my writing. So,
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so in some ways that's like starting out like emulation,
Right,
and wanting to not just, be the reader, but, the creator. too.
Right. Right.
That has to be interesting, having a critic sit there and
It'd be so...
study you. Like,
Yeah.
like you said, you learned something from it, but like, was it at a point like, this dude is just talking about me the whole time?
No, it was cool. I liked it. I was like, and in some ways, his theory was correct. I was like,
Kind of insightful.
here, he's someone who's paying attention to the things that I've made, and, and I'm like, in some ways it felt like, finally, someone's paying attention. Now that I have your attention.
Right. So we have about 10 minutes left. Do you have any advice for young writers before we go?
Yeah, I think that the advice that I always like to impart, if I can, is it's not necessarily process or advice or, anything in terms of technique or what you should do, but it's more like philosophical advice. I think that if you're going to be a writer and you're taking it very seriously, that even if you've fallen in love with a particular author or a particular type of a story, that what you want to do is definitely write something that's yours, and that means something to you beyond the idea of just writing a story to be published. I think I guess what I mean by that is that I see a lot of people who, I come across them at least at writers' conferences, that people who, they want to write, but they want to write to be published. And like, there's like no other particular thing that like is behind their motivation. And so a lot of those types of writers, I feel they tend to chase after trends, and what they think is selling. And I think that's, however practical that is, I don't think you can predict what's going to sell. The thing that's a trend now didn't used to be, and by the time you're finished with your book, it might no longer be a trend.
Mm-hmm.
And B, I don't think that copycat fiction is generally good. And I think that especially if you're going to write a novel, that if you write a novel and it doesn't sell, it never gets published, maybe the only people who ever read it are your friends, or your family members, that you should at least have written a book that means something to you, even if the rest of the world doesn't get to see it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And then it doesn't feel like a waste of time, that it was for you in the end, even if no one else reads it. And you can at least get something out of it like that, because a lot of books don't get published. So if you're gonna, spend a year or 2 or 3 or 4 or longer in some cases writing a novel, then you should have a motivation to do it and to make something yours and wholly yours and unique beyond the motivation to publish.
Mm-hmm.
And or to be rich and famous.
Right. Probably not gonna happen.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a tough industry, and it is an industry, and I think a lot of younger writers don't realize how much of an industry it is and how much, what goes into that. And, that was something I had to learn too, coming into it. I had a lot of idealistic, notions about publishing or writing, There's a business side to it,
Right.
and there's a reality to how books, get made beyond the writing at your desk, and you definitely have to keep true to yourself, as cliche as that sounds, because otherwise it just, I don't know. At least for me, I would think that would be a hollow activity. You got to keep it meaningful, keep it real.
Right. Well, there you have it.
On that note, keep it real.
On that note, let's keep it real. You've been listening to the Penguin Review on Rookery Radio. A few announcements. You can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. We're also on Tumblr and Pinterest at Penguin Review. Our website is penguinreview.com. You can get all kinds of information there. We are accepting creative submissions of any kind, whether it's creative writing or artwork, until December 1st. So, go to our website, penguinreview.com. All our submission guidelines are on there, and you can send us some stuff. We're really excited to look at submissions. We meet Thursdays at 4 in room 006, Fedor Hall. If you're interested in working with us, you want to come hang out, we would love to see you. We're working on the 50th anniversary edition right now, which is coming out in November. More details on that to follow. Am I missing anything, guys?
No, you're
I think you hit it. I think you've hit it all on the nose.
Yeah, trying to get it all. All right, thank you guys for listening.
Want to thank our guest here,
Oh, thanks for having
Chris
me.
Barzak. Go buy his books; they're great.
Absolutely.
Thank you.